The sounds of Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart have echoed through the great music halls of the world for centuries. But one renowned musician who has played many of those venues thought the beauty of classical music should be shared in places where you'd least expect to hear it. Harry Smith has our Sunday closer.
The music, Dvorak. The venue, a homeless shelter.
And it reminds me of like old movies.
Old movies?
Yeah.
The group is led by concert violinist Kelly Hall-Tompkins, whose real job is playing as a soloist with orchestras around the world.
This piece, hopefully in our performance today, will do something to turn around something, whatever it is that you're holding in your mind.
Some years back, Tompkins played her violin in a soup kitchen where she volunteered. Her life was immediately changed.
I felt this incredible sense of engagement and absorption in what the music was saying. And as a performing artist, that is what we crave.
Since then, Kelly and her cohorts have played more than 100 concerts in homeless shelters. She calls her endeavor Music Kitchen.
I want this contact that we've had, this concert, this music, to stay with them for a lifetime.
At every concert, there is an exuberant and sometimes surprising dialogue with the audience.
Warner Brothers cartoons. That was my first exposure to classical music. Well, that's Wagner. Killed, everybody.
Tompkins hands cards to her listeners and asks them to write down their feelings. She's kept every one of them and is now commissioning composers to write songs based on those words.
It's been years since I heard music.
By doing so, she is literally giving voice to the voiceless. The audience loves it.
What was this concert like for you today?
It was invigorating. It was something new.
The musicians are also transformed. Some even prefer playing here to a concert hall.
This is something that's very near and dear to me, is to come and play for people that don't have the access, to the kind of music that we play and the kind of culture that we're privy to at this point.
Tompkins is driven by her passion for music and the possibility that her audience, if even for a moment, can feel what she feels.
What keeps me doing it is reading those cards and seeing the reaction and seeing the tears and seeing the joy. I love seeing what music can do for people.
For Sunday Today, Harry Smith, New York.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Freddos. I'm a sociologist who taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. 252 years after Beethoven's birth, his revolutionary musical influence is felt around the classical music world. He's a beloved and revered figure, speaking to all peoples around the world with his affirmation that music is nature itself, transcending time, divorced from the constraining limits of the everyday world and reflecting eternal and universal truths. His musical stylistic innovations bridged the classical and romantic periods. His life was shaped by the French Revolution and its aftermath. As an intensely political child of the Enlightenment, the rights of man, and steeped in the most progressive thought of his time, his music was subversive, passionately democratic, and freedom exalting. As he wrote in various letters throughout his life, one needs to love liberty above all else. Freedom, what more does one want? My zeal is to serve the oppressed and our poor suffering humanity in any way whatsoever by means of my art. I have made no compromise with any lower motive. We're thrilled and honored to have three performers and musicians on the Radical Imagination today whose artistry and work follows in the best of this political, humanitarian, philosophical, and musical tradition. As Beethoven witnessed the birth pangs of the modern world in his day, we too witness in our time anti-democratic, authoritarian struggles trying to prop up corrupt and decaying old regimes. Our guests are in the forefront of the struggle to transform a deeply profound, damaged world, to make and remake it through music. Kelly Hall-Tompkins is a virtuoso violinist and the founder of Music Kitchen for the Soul, a program that lifts the spirit of homeless New Yorkers through live classical music recitals. She's performed as the fiddler in the Grammy and Tony-nominated Broadway revival production of Fiddler on the Roof. Kelly has appeared as a soloist with orchestras around the world. In 2017, was named by the New York Times as a New Yorker of the Year, and in 2020 was featured in the PBS Great Performance documentary on Fiddler, A Miracle of Miracles. Bruce Adolph is a prolific composer, well-known author, pianist, human rights activist, and is known to millions as the piano puzzler on American public media's performance today. He is the author of Human Rights and Music. Julian Fifer is executive director of Musicians for Human Rights, a world-renowned cellist, founder of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, and an editor of the influential and highly respected Routledge Companion to Music and Human Rights. So thank you all very, very much. Very honored and ecstatically happy to have you all on this show on the Radical Imagination. Thank you again.
Great to be here.
Great to be here. Pleasure. So, and it just happened. Let me, if it's okay, can we just really dive in here? This was an article that was in the Times about a week, 10 days ago. The role of art in a time of war. It's a rather long article. And let me give you a direct quote to get us started in our discussion. The reason you need art in wartime is because history cannot exist without the discipline of imagination. Through art, we establish similarities between past and future, near and far, abstract and concrete, that cast received certainties into doubt. We look and listen in a way that lets thinking and feeling run parallel to each other. And in extreme times, this sort of cultural appreciation can rise from an analytic to a moral plane. It's simply to say that the best art depicts war matters for its own sake, and its full value lies in a realm beyond communication or advocacy. So you all are performers, artists, composers, and activists. What is your response to those dimensions in your own life as it relates to just what I've just said here? What is the role of art in a time of trauma and crisis, political upheaval?
If I may, I would say that it grounds us to our humanity. I think that's one of the most important things to do in a time of trauma and crisis. I know not only with my work in the shelters, in the homeless shelters with Music Kitchen, Food for the Soul, but I also self-published a Holocaust memoir of a dear friend of mine, Alfred Muir, The Last Quartet. And when it was still possible in Krakow, in Poland, he and some friends and colleagues would play string quartets in the ghetto. And that was received with mixed reaction. There were some that were totally sustained by that, mooring to their daily lives, their humanity, their reason and right to exist. And there are others who said to them, "How dare you play music at a time like this?" So I think it's a very complex issue, but it's been my experience with Music Kitchen that it really when people are struggling for survival, which is about the most extreme form of existence that we can have, it helps to reorient people back to their humanity and their right to exist.
You know, there are a few chapters in in the book, The Routledge Companion to Music and Human Rights, that touch on this as well. There's a chapter written by Manfred Novak, who was in Sarajevo during some of the years of the war there. And he speaks about the cellist of Sarajevo, who's, I think, quite well known for sitting amongst the rubble of the conservatory and playing the cello for the public and being out in the middle of the streets performing, and of string quartets still meeting, that they needed to be in touch with their essence and with each other, and just how vital that was. There's also a chapter that looks at Victor Ullmann's Last Piano Sonata. Victor Ullmann died in Theresienstadt, concentration camp in World War II. And there too, Ullmann, in his own words, speaks about the importance of giving voice to his own experiences, as well as to try to bring solace and determination and hope to his fellow captives in the camp.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both comments, of course. I mean, and Kelly, the word humanity is exactly where I was going with this. I wasn't sure about the word moral in the thing that you read. It's hard to know about morality because it's a little coming from a certain place. But what's great about music is that words like morality don't get said, because we're talking about, at least what I'm thinking of is wordless music, which is, words get us into trouble and language gets us into trouble, but music does take us past that problem. It's deeper, it's more connective and more meaningful. And I think along with humanity comes a kind of the frailty of our condition. And music reminds us that we're vulnerable and frail and all the same when it comes down to it. And so the ultimate purpose of music really is community. And I think that's its power. And it needs to do this all the time, not just during wartime, of course, but during war, as Bernstein said, we needed even more to play it more profoundly and deeply with more urgency.
And Kelly, you've tried to reach new audiences, haven't you? As founder of Music Kitchen for the Soul. Tell us a little about that very concretely, because again, you're dealing with people who've been stigmatized and ostracized and in so many ways negatively labeled, and you're trying to turn that around and give their souls some happiness too. So how did this all come about?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think that your struggle for survival is one of the most extreme versions of our existence, and it leaves little room for the spiritual enlightenment and sustenance that really can govern the trajectory of our lives. And so Music Kitchen gets to sort of break through that crust of daily survival to a more infinite, more inspired, more just a non-tangible but an inspired place for at least those 60 minutes of the hour that we bring artists to the shelters. And it's been incredibly powerful. It's, I've seen people, through all, Music Kitchen has been in existence for 15 years. I founded it in 2005, or sorry, it was 15 years now, with the plus 2 of the pandemic. It's 17 years now. And through several kinds of different disasters, during the economic turned down at the 2007, 2009 period. There was quite a lot of agitation there, a lot of uncertainty, certainly in a pandemic similarly. But through all of those situations in the country and in the world, I've seen how music can cut through and give the listeners another another chance at reaching for the better part of their lives. I've seen people choose to be part of substance abuse programs after being part of our concerts. I've seen people have a renewed energy in getting their apartments sorted out and getting furnished and getting out of the shelters. Just incredible transformational things in people's lives. It started because as a violin soloist, I like running through my repertoire for people. And at the time, in 2004, I was preparing for a concert, and a dear friend, turned out the pastor of my church, was dying. And I just didn't have the presence of mind to organize with my friends and colleagues. But I was a volunteer cook at the shelter. And as I was getting closer to the concert, but really involved in the story of the unfolding of this gentleman who was dying, in a pinch at the last minute, I just said, I'll just play for the guys at the church shelter. And I was feeling terribly guilty about it because I thought, who but professional musicians can stand to hear a violin concerto without accompaniment? But when I went there to play for them, they loved it so much. They asked me to come back the next night, and I did. And I played the exact same music, and they were even more taken with it the second time. We were quite taken with each other, honestly. And it became clear that I needed to start a program to bring music properly and regularly, not solo music, but really chamber music, which is the more powerful music of community and belonging. And so, yeah, that's how it got started. And we haven't looked back. 30,000 shelter clients reached, and over 200 artists, and over 100 concerts. And it's been one of the most extraordinary journeys of my life.
As you say, rooted in your experiences in the church as a Lutheran, you're from South Carolina, right? So
yes,
you're rooted in that. And of course, Julian and Bruce come from different traditions, right?
Yes.
We're talking about what would you, New York secular Jews, or
Exactly.
Exactly.
there we go. So you're transcending your own worlds here, but let me just. I have a little quote here from you, Bruce, too, in your chapter in Human Rights and Music, which I think is apropos of what Kelly just said. And touching on the issue of power, such music can indeed be a threat to those in power who wish to control society by separating people by race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or any other means. So you're all trying to unite us with our humanity, whereas we have so many other forces trying to divide and keep us divided at each other's throats. One of the things that, of course, one can learn about issues of poverty is that we can, as we tend to do in this society, look at it as an individual failure, or if you're more progressive in your orientation, it's a collective manifestation of an unfair political economic system that's created and perpetuated that poverty. So you're thrusting yourself into this world with your beautiful music and your artistry into a hotbed of political struggle as well. Isn't that true?
Jim, I think that at first you go to music, a person comes to music to just because of music. I mean, you love music, you want to play, you want to write, and it doesn't become a mission at first. In fact, in a way, music is a refuge. It's a place to go, to be with other people who play music and to be with that community and to explore the art form itself. Then as time goes on, one finds that you have a platform, as Kelly did with her experience with finding Music Kitchen just by playing, and then realizing what was the potential experience. And I think that speaks to what happens generally, which is musicians go to music because of the love of music and ability for it, and then discover that there's a platform and then a responsibility. And if you get to the point where you have that awareness of the responsibility and the ability to use the music itself to speak, that's a fantastic set of circumstances, a consilience that we're just lucky that happened to us. And to seize upon it, usually, I think, comes through a series of coincidences and circumstances beyond your control, which you have to recognize and grab. It's like seize the day, just as Kelly's story perfectly illustrates.
Yeah, it becomes a platform and a responsibility, and part of the responsibility for me comes out of recognizing that it's a privilege, and I've been very fortunate to have been introduced to music and to be able to study and to be funded by family to study and to be able to go to certain schools, and that so many people around me, you don't even have to go to other parts of the world, right here down the street in Portland, Oregon, don't have those opportunities. And I feel that we do all have an obligation to help fulfill the human rights of others that are less fortunate, and the platform has been the way for us to do that now.
Well put, but not too long ago, right? The platform was couched more in, if you will, struggle in the Cold War. Again, as we mentioned right before the show, my friend Eugene Fodor, I think it was the early '80s, or won the Tchaikovsky, the Paganini competition, and was brought to the White House. It was more, wow, America has won. We defeated the Russians and all that. So you're talking about an entirely different platform here, aren't you?
Well, it's also entirely, I think it's most effective on the ground, very grassroots, person to person. And that's exactly what Kelly is doing.
Well, there's another way that, that we're fighting cold wars and that we're, using our platform. I'm sometimes just a platform just by walking in the room with a violin. I, just as Julian said, I feel also very, very blessed and privileged to study the violin, to have been able to study the violin, to have a family that supported me and sent me to all the schools that I needed to do, and still within that privilege, there's also a lot of there are a lot of glass ceilings, and in my life, I've had not nearly as many as those who've come before me. I know, the powers that be, the record companies that segregated music in the way that we hear it. They wouldn't allow certain artists that looked a certain way to record on their labels certain kinds of music. And I know that there are some jazz artists that would have liked to be classical artists, but they were sort of funneled into, another career path as more desirable to whatever that entity was. So, I mean, I've always been there are certainly obstacles, but I've always been a person that fully exercises my autonomy and self-direction. And it's amazing how that can just be a platform in and of itself, just by walking in the room. And I consider that a tremendous responsibility as well, as Julie mentioned.
I think in the interview you described yourself as also an entrepreneur, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Beethoven was also, right, an independent entrepreneur. He was one of the first of musicians who were not beholden to, to the church or some aristocracy who was funding him. Is that correct? Or
yeah, that's right.
Okay, so. Right. It's again Fiddler on the Roof here. You're on the roof, right? We're gonna get to Fiddler, I know. But here it's precarious up there, right? And where do you push the envelope? And this is just not music. All right, it's the academic world, it's the political world, it's the athletic world. I was thinking of Colin Kaepernick. What do you do when you take a knee protesting, for Black Lives Matter? What happened to him? What price did he pay? What price would you all pay, perhaps, if you push the envelope in a way that really confronted? For example, let me mention this in passing. My mentor was Richard Cloward, a sociologist who organized welfare recipients in the welfare rights movement, late 60s and early 70s, advocating for a guaranteed annual income. All right. Now that would have reduced poverty in this country by such a substantial number. It would have been tremendous. It didn't happen, obviously. Now, where do you as musicians, as creative artists, as people with a conscience and so on, find yourself in this larger political struggle? Do you put yourself on the line for example, a policy that would bring about a guaranteed income? How would you fit into the Poor People's Campaign, for example?
Well, but many people are doing that every day and have done that every day. And again, just simply because of the recent book, one of the voices in the book is a Vietnamese singer, songwriter, guitarist, Mai Khoi, and she ended up speaking out about the concentration camps inside of re-education camps inside of Vietnam, and the lack of rights of women and of the average citizen. And ultimately, she had to seek asylum in the United States, and that's the price that she's paid. And Rami Essam, who was one of the voices of the Egyptian Revolution, he was imprisoned and tortured, and fortunately, through great legal assistance, was able to get out and leave the country. But his video editor died in prison in Egypt. So there are people paying prices all the time. Their music is censored, and people are tortured. They're killed. So there are many people on the front lines of this.
I'd say the book chapter in the human rights, the Rutledge Companion, is one of the most forceful ways I've used my voice to be right in the crux of, some of the things that I think that are most relevant in our time. I use my voice, my playing voice, my speaking voice. I'm a public speaker as well, as a violinist and writer, as it were. I just did I've had the honor of delivering 3 commencement addresses. And the most recent one was to the largest audience ever for me, 15,000 people. And it was, I received a very strong ovation for that speech. But I did receive one negative feedback for pointing out the racism in our society. Someone sought me out on social media to call me a racist. I think that the potential consequences are everywhere. And as I mentioned, sometimes just showing up in the room and speaking your truth is provocative. Right. So yeah, that's a high wire act on a day-to-day basis in a lot of different ways. There's, I have no way to turn that off by being, except to not show up in the room, and I refuse. I will always show up.
See, I knew you were going to bring us back to Fiddler here. That was a high wire act. Okay, so how did the Fiddler project get started, and what is the universal connection that people all around the world, non-Western cultures, feel for this? So it's not just Julian and Bruce's and my people too. I mean, this is.
I was Jewish in another life. Maybe this.
Well, Lutheran.
Kelly, I knew you looked familiar.
There you go. There we go. Well, we all connected. One world, Bob Marley, right? So there we go. But tell us about that. And we're playing that clip, of course, on the show here today. You're not going to see it at this point, but it's unbelievable. It's so beautiful. It's so connected. And you raise that. You point out how people connect to the message, even if they don't know the language. So tell us a little about that. Tell us how that got started, that project.
Well, I was doing my solo work, and I also occasionally play as a concertmaster for the New York Pops. And there's a gentleman who is a coordinator for Broadway and also a major manager for Itzhak Perlman and other artists like that. And he heard my playing, he heard my solo playing, and invited me to be on Fiddler. And I was honored and flattered and really excited about it. I had never done Broadway before, and I wasn't totally sure about it. My husband, who had done a fair amount of Broadway, said, you probably only want to do 6 shows a week so you don't, go nuts. But I became I'm probably the only person, not only in this gathering, but anywhere in the world, who was not Tevye in high school. In a production. So well, I wasn't. Okay, well, then there's like another person.
Right.
No, but it was, just suffice it to say, it was such a beloved musical that it seemed everybody had a role in their high school musical. And I had not. I guess you could say, as concertmaster of my youth orchestra, I did play just that very tiny opening solo, dum ba dum bum bum bum. So maybe I guess I count too. In high school, I was part of Fiddler. But yeah, I became part of the production, and we had just such an incredible and a magical and a wonderful company. Everything about it, I was just so taken with it. There was zero chance that I was gonna take any time off, apart from my other contracted solo concerts, which I reluctantly took off to play. But I was so thoroughly inspired. They wrote solos in the production that don't normally exist in the score for me. And so I had this clay to mold. I loved being able to watch the cast, and we had the actors, that is, we had a wonderful symbiotic relationship and played off of one another. And it was incredibly inspiring. It felt like important work. The themes that I think resonate in Fiddler are not all, there's so many. I think especially women's empowerment, women coming of age and women's empowerment. And obviously that's a major theme of Fiddler, even as also, which I obviously can relate to. And also the idea of marginalized people, displaced people. I connected actually with the story of Anne Frank as a young person in middle school, and that it deeply affected me. So that I've carried with me for a long time. But I think as that relates to my story, our story as African Americans, I was deeply touched by that. I took it very seriously. As I mentioned before the show, I'm a serious person. I never dialed it in. When the pogrom scene, I had a solo after that, completely alone in the theater to give voice to that moment. And I watched Danny Burstein and the characters of our Anatevka village, and I soaked that in, and I allowed that to become a part of me as I played that solo and rendered the grief and the pain of that pogrom. I just was thoroughly moved by it, and it definitely was one of the most important personal and professional experiences of my life.
And now with the invasion of Ukraine, with Russia, it's even more direct, and everything Kelly said is obviously true and important. And specifically, though, and this is after you were, this happened after you were through with Fiddler, but again, the show now has a very specific resonance, unfortunately, with practically a reenactment of the story of Fiddler for many people.
Well, we had our production actually, Bart Shear modeled the staging of our production at that time, 2015, late 2015, 2016, after the Syrian refugee crisis. Mm-hmm. And so the staging of the final scene, he drew a lot from those images. So I think there's And now, as Bruce mentions, we're walking right into the story of the actual part of the world where Fiddler is drawn from. The atrocities happening with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. It's. I had the opportunity to go to the Ukraine about a year after our production, and going to Baba Yar. It was for me already like walking into the story of Fiddler that we had brought to life some 400 times on stage.
Yeah. But again, as you've reminded us, Julian, and Adolph, in your writings, music can be used in a variety of ways. Music can be used by despots, as well as revolutionary democrats, in the sense of Beethoven. Beethoven's music, right, was championed by a lot of repressive leaders as well.
Yeah, well, during World War II, which is what I think you're referring to, Beethoven was co-opted by the Nazis as well as by the Allies. Everybody was using Beethoven. The opening of the Fifth Symphony, da 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 da, that became a da da dash, this victory, V for victory. But it is true, and there are several excellent books on this exact topic of Beethoven being used by all sorts of very different philosophies, including fascist philosophy, as well as Beethoven as the representative of freedom in music. It's complex, but it's there are elements. It's an interpretive art, and unfortunately, everything can be interpreted in endless ways. I mean, and maybe not unfortunately. That's the human mind at work. You see what you want to see, and you hear what you want to hear. But
how can we break that cycle, Bruce? I mean, is this a never-ending sort of thing? We've seen this before, and yet
never-ending so far.
Pardon me?
Never-ending so far.
But this is where I feel that music and the arts generally have a valuable role to play, because people who are introduced and are involved in artistic forms generally learn that the world is not binary. It's not yes and no, right and wrong. You realize that there are many interpretations, whether you're a dancer or an actor or a musician, any artistic form. And you also learn a lot about yourself, because you're constantly struggling with your own limitations as you try to give voice to what you're feeling or what you're thinking. So there's a lot of work you're doing internally, as well as recognizing that there are many ways this piece of clay can be molded, or this phrase in the Beethoven symphony can be played. So you learn to respect the opinions of others, just as you want your voice to be heard. And that's why I guess, well, actually, in one of my chapters, I talked about the playing field of human rights, and making a comparison with chamber music, and the idea that we all want to have freedom of thought and freedom of expression, Articles 18 and 19 of the Universal Declaration, but we also have responsibilities to the community, which is Article 29. And every ensemble finds its own balance of essentially those two elements.
I think also this exact topic, talking about the multiple interpretations of music, is illustrated by the genius of the songs that enslaved African Americans would sing, so-called plantation songs or spirituals, which they were forbidden to gather, forbidden to learn formally, forbidden to do all of these things, and yet the songs, which appeared to be the moniker, the false moniker of the happy slave, was really encoded with complex messages about escape, about sustenance, about humanity. And those are the songs really that form the undergirding, the foundation of all of American music. So I think that's a really powerful element of music. people can co-opt that how they wish, but I do think that the power of the music is sort of baked in, similarly to Shostakovich. I think the Stalinist regime would have liked to interpret some of the more heroic textures of his writing to their aggrandizement, but I think it was really more. I think I forever hear in Shostakovich that he gives voice to the downtrodden, that he gives voice to the people that are being oppressed.
Subversive. I think subversive is the slave narratives were subversive. As a child of the South, help us understand what, if you can, what the white church, those who go, to the churches, white people who are going to the churches down there, what's the music they're listening to?
Well, I grew up Lutheran, I grew up Lutheran, which, there are Black Lutherans. I think the first church that I went to when I was really small, till I was about 5 or 6 years old, was a Black Lutheran church. But the city that in South Carolina, when we moved there, like most things that I did in my life, we were one of the few African Americans in my church, my school, my neighborhood, you name it. So I think that for me, and we became Lutheran because my mom at a young age, talk about self-actualization. My whole family background is Southern Baptist. My grandmother is Southern Baptist. But my mom at 7 years old went to a vacation Bible school at the Lutheran church, the same one that I ended up growing up in until I was 5. And she said, I want to switch to the Lutheran church. My grandmother said, okay, as long as they, cover the bases, whatever, that's fine with me. So she became Lutheran on her own, which is why I grew up Lutheran. But I think that there is something about that was already chosen for me, because it goes so perfectly with my absolute passion for classical music. So for me, God speaks Baroque. I mean, that's like the most important language. And that's what I grew up with. And, and then of course, my musical tastes have evolved to more romantic and contemporary music, but that's really the foundation of music for me, and I'm quite comfortable with it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the quote of the show. God speaks Baroque. I always remember that. Now, is that true?
Oh, absolutely.
Julian, does God speak Baroque, or is it more fiddler?
Well, hold on.
Well, first of all,
First
of all, we have to discuss which God we're talking about, and and aren't there?
There's one God, right?
And there also you don't need God to love music yourself. So I think it's rather limiting. We're going down a difficult path here.
Yeah, I understand.
Except for
I'm being facetious, but I'm not religious.
I do want to throw in that for a lot of musicians, Bach is like a god. In that when you say Baroque, deep down we all know it's Bach, and because there's probably no musician in any kind of Western style of music, any expression of music, that doesn't revere Bach's perfection of the vertical and the horizontal. So there is something, but in other words, harmony and melody all fitting together, the complete counterpoint. There's practically never been any other music that reaches the level of perfection of craft of Bach, even though lots of great music is happening all the time and always has been. So taking God as a metaphor and Bach as a supreme example of brilliant composition, we can be happy about that.
What would God say about Beethoven?
I was going to say that, Julian. Exactly.
I love
wasn't
Brahms.
trying to be a god, was he? Okay, go ahead.
I love Brahms and and Impressionism and so much. I'm being a bit facetious, but it came to me very strongly when through the lens of, I grew up Lutheran. I'm not terribly religious now, but when I was looking for some other thing to belong to at a certain point, I tried out other things like Unitarians or whatever, and just the music doesn't. It's not right. So
Unitarians don't play a lot of music. I went to the Unitarians as well.
It's confirmed how firmly rooted in that.
I was the music director of a Unitarian church for quite a few years, and
really?
when I had that position, there was a lot of Bach, actually, but also contemporary music. Now, we're slightly off where we were, but it's always nice to hear Kelly talk about her background. And I have to say, even though we've known each other in various ways for a few years, not terribly well, although better recently, the chapter you wrote for the book, Kelly, was just a revelation to me, because I thought I knew you a certain way, and then you really had the courage to tell your story very profoundly and very directly, and I think it's one of the highlights of the book in that respect. It's quite amazing.
Well, we're rapidly running out of time, very unfortunately, but all three of you bring such interesting backgrounds and creativity to our discussion today. I just wish we could put you three in a bottle and tip you around the world and have, we do. This is our bottle. This is the show. And more people can see it and hear and feel what you're saying. I think that's an absolute hope for humanity. And perhaps we won't keep repeating this cycle of violence and hatred and oppression. And I think we've got to keep trying. And I think what you're describing here, what you've all stood for, is a magnificent way of getting out of this very, very profoundly destructive pattern. So thank you so very, very much for being who you are as individuals and collectively what you're trying to do in your artistry. I admire and respect you, and thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, my fellow panelists. It's been such an honor.
Fellow panelists, yes. All right. Well, thank you. And God is more than Baroque, but he is also Baroque, or she is as well. So we will leave it at that, and we hopefully will continue our discussion with all our panelists again at another time for another show, because there's a lot more to talk about. Thank you so very, very much. This is Jim Freddos, wishing you a good week, and take care. See you next week on The Radical Imagination.
Thank you.